Welcome to Energy Unplugged, the go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. My name is Salman Khan, and I'm a principal in advisory team covering Ireland and GB electricity markets. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the new Renewable Electricity Support Scheme in Northern Ireland, which we have helped to create here at Aurora in partnership with the Northern Irish government. We'll be talking not only about the details of the new scheme and its impact on the power system on the island of Ireland, but also look behind the scenes at how the team is thinking about the design. The two guests today are perfectly placed to bring us up to speed on this. I'd like to welcome Michael Joos and Steph Unsworth to the show. Michael has been working closely with the Northern Irish government for over a year on a project to design this support scheme, and Steph is our foremost expert on I-SEM power market here at Aurora. Pleased to have you both on the podcast, and thank you for your time. Let's start with a quick round of introductions. Steph, do you want to go first, please?
Thank you, Salman. Thank you for having us today. I'm Steph Unsworth. I'm the product manager for our I-SEM product here at Aurora. So I spend a lot of time looking at all things on the island of Ireland, including renewable energy and also flexible energy.
Thank you, Steph. Michael?
Thanks, Salman. So my name is Michael Joos. I'm a senior associate in the UK and Ireland advisory team at Aurora, and I'm managing the project we're delivering for the Northern Irish government, supporting the design of the new scheme. And at this point, I just want to clarify that anything I say in this podcast is in a personal capacity and not on behalf of the Northern Irish government. So the views I express are my own and not necessarily endorsed by the government.
Thank you, Michael. So let's kick off. And Michael, if I can come to you, and if you can give us some context here, why do we need a new support scheme in Northern Ireland?
So the key driver of this is the target of 80% renewable electricity by 2030 in Northern Ireland. And that means 80% of final electricity consumption has to come from renewable sources. And this target has been enshrined in law in the Climate Change Act Northern Ireland in 2022, where the target was updated from 70% to 80%. And this is also in line with the South, which also has a 80% by 2030 target. And these are highly ambitious targets. Current levels of renewable penetration are at 46% in Northern Ireland. And it's much harder and more expensive to double from 40% to 80% than it is from, say, 20% to 40%. For a higher penetration of renewables, the volatility of renewables gets increasingly difficult, hard to manage. And furthermore, due to growth of electricity demand, the 80% target means that renewable generation needs to be more than doubled compared to today's levels. However, the existing support scheme was closed to new applicants in 2017 because it was deemed no longer cost effective. And since this closure, we've seen only very low levels of investment and almost no new renewable capacity has been added. So a new scheme is urgently needed to drive investment towards the 2030 target.
Oh, okay. So, Michael, this seems like quite an enormous challenge. Steph, if I can bring you in, can you comment on the scale of this challenge for our audiences?
Of course, I guess to put some numbers behind this. So our existing renewables are generating about 3 terawatt hours per year. But our demand in Northern Ireland is forecast by Sony, the system operator, to reach 10 terawatt hours by 2030. So an 80% of this is going to be 8 terawatt hours. So this means we need roughly 5 terawatt hours of additional new renewables to come onto the system, which is roughly about 1.7 gigawatts of offshore wind. So 1.7 gigawatts might not sound like a lot when we're comparing it to some other markets, such as the 15 gigawatts of installed onshore wind capacity we have in GB, for example. But Northern Ireland is a very small system and it faces a lot of challenges, primarily relating to planning and the grid, both in terms of grid congestion, but also actually finding an available connection. So these are some of the major bottlenecks that need to be addressed as soon as possible, alongside this new scheme to bring these new renewables onto the system.
Quite intriguing stuff. So, Michael, what I understood from you is that we're just talking about onshore renewables, so that includes onshore wind and solar capacity. Where does offshore wind fit in here?
Yes, so there are offshore targets as well. So Northern Ireland has a target of 1 gigawatt of offshore wind from 2030 onwards. And the South has a target of 5 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity by 2030. with an additional 2 gigawatts of offshore wind to hydrogen capacity to be deployed by the same date. So longer term, there's even a whopping target of 37 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050. However, it's unlikely that offshore wind deployment will materialize on a large scale before 2030 on the island. And the main reason for that is that permitting construction and connection of projects will take too long. And the key reason then for this is that the grid is not ready to deal with these large additional volumes, which will lead to heavy constraints on the system. We actually have an upcoming group meeting discussing this. And furthermore, there are questions around the port infrastructure required to facilitate these offshore developments. Currently, very few ports on the island are suitably equipped for these operations. And then in addition, there are currently no grid-connected offshore wind projects installed on the island of Ireland. So developers do not yet have any project experience to draw upon, and this could delay construction timelines. So hence the new scheme in Northern Ireland will focus on onshore renewables to 2030, but it's definitely planned to involve offshore wind after 2030.
I'm just mindful of the fact that we might be putting out a lot of jargon. So let's maybe start defining some of these terms. Steph, I want to come to you. We've mentioned I-SEM a few times, which is the power market on the island of Ireland. Can you please clarify how the I-SEM is structured?
Of course. So I-SEM firstly stands for the Integrated Single Electricity Market, and it exists across both Ireland and Northern Ireland. So this is a single market. So there's a single wholesale price, there's a single day-ahead market. The two regions are connected by the North-South tie line, which is an interconnector between the two. And we also have interconnection to GB, both through the East-West interconnector, which connects Ireland to Wales, and then also the Moyle interconnector, which connects Northern Ireland to Scotland. And then from 2026, 27, depending on when you believe it's going to come online, we also have the Celtic interconnector, which will integrate the I-SEM into the wider European market by interconnecting us with France.
Right. Thank you for that, Steph. I want to also provide an introduction to CFDs for our audiences. So the proposed scheme takes the form of a contract for difference, in other words, a CFD, like those which already exist in the Republic of Ireland and in GB. Steph, before we delve into the details, can you explain what this means? What is a CFD?
Of course. So within a CFD or contract for difference, you have a fixed price known as a strike price. So generators will sell their power that they produce at the market price. So this may be the day-ahead market. And if the market price is below this strike price, they will receive a top-up from the government. And if the market price is above the strike price, they will pay back the difference to the government. So generators always end up with this guaranteed fixed price for any power which they generate. So not only does this hedge against falling power prices, it also gives renewables a route to market, because having a guaranteed revenue stream makes it much easier to secure financing to build a new project. The level of this strike price will be determined by an auction to make sure that the lowest bids are accepted and the lowest possible price is accepted to keep costs down for consumers.
Michael, if I can bring you in, I'm sure that people would be quite interested to understand how frequently these auctions happen and when is the next one going to happen, or let's say the first one going to happen.
Yes, absolutely. So at the moment, we're planning for 2 auctions to take us to 2030. Auction 1 would be in 2025 and auction 2 in 2027. And they will provisionally deliver 1 terawatt hour and 2.5 terawatt hour of annual generation, respectively. So this only adds to 3.2 terawatt hours. And as Steph mentioned, we need 5 terawatt hours. So, and the reason for this is so to keep the scheme competitive and to keep the generation with state support to a minimum, not all additional volumes required for this target, for the 5 terawatt hours, will be procured through the scheme. So we envisage only 70% will use the CFD as their route to market, but then the remaining 30% will become operational using a different route to market by signing a long-term power purchase agreement, typically with a corporate off-taker. And that's based on trends observed across Ireland and GB, as well as the assumption that the support scheme will crowd in financing such that some of the projects that are unsuccessful in the scheme or in the auctions will still go ahead with these alternative route to markets. And if the 5 terawatt hour are successfully delivered through the 2 auctions and other routes to market, then we may well run out of suitable land space and grid connections to build any more onshore renewables. Thus, future auctions could be considered at some point to replace retiring capacity, as well as for adding offshore renewables. But the first 2 auctions are really the important ones for the 2030 target and for the near term.
Let's maybe delve into some of these details and the design of the scheme. So, Steph, if I can bring you in, what are some of the key features and how do they differ from the schemes that we have in the Republic of Ireland and in GB?
Yes, so starting with the eligibility of projects, this auction will be open to all onshore technologies, including onshore wind and solar PV. These projects must have planning permission and a grid connection offer prior to entering the auction. There will be a minimum size requirement of 5 megawatt hours, though this is still yet to be confirmed, and the scheme will only be open to new or substantially repowering sites. In terms of design, there's going to be one pot for onshore wind and for solar, and there will be another pot for all the other technologies which we might have entering the auction. The auction will be a pay-as-clear with a technology-specific maximum strike price. So this is one of the key differences to the RES auction within Ireland, which is a pay-as-bid auction. The contract itself will be 15 years and will be fully indexed to inflation. So this is the exact same as what we see in GB, but this is a clear market change from what we see in Ireland, where RES only has partial indexation. There'll be a delivery date of 2 years after the auction, and we expect that compensation for all types of curtailment, so this will include oversupply and negative price periods, but also any of the non-market-based redispatch. And the reference price, which will be used in determination of top-ups and payback, will be the I-SEM day-ahead hourly market price.
Right, so we do see some common grounds as far as having different pots for onshore and offshore renewable technologies is concerned. Michael, I want to ring you in now for this. What was your approach in designing this scheme? Like, how did you come up with your recommendations?
Yes, so our approach was an assessment of alternative design choices against the objectives of the scheme, and it can be summarized in 3 steps. Step 1 was to determine key design features and options for these features. And for that, we built on literature review, consultation by the government on the scheme, and review of schemes in other geographies to understand or create these key features and options. So an example for a feature would be the contract length of the CFD, with options of 10, 15, 20 years typically considered. Step 2 consisted then of the assessment of each potential design option against the objectives of the scheme. And the objectives of the scheme were given by the government, and they align with the energy trilemma, meaning sustainability, affordability of energy, and security of supply. And this assessment was informed through literature review, expert interviews, and quantitative analysis. And at the end of this, we arrived at preliminary recommendations. And then the 3rd step consisted of a workshop with key Northern Irish power market stakeholders, including developers, regulators, the network operators. And we had this workshop to gain their feedback on our initial recommendations, which were then subsequently refined.
So, Michael, since this is an ongoing project, for our audiences, can you please clarify the key milestones in the, let's say, the later phases of the project? And then what is the end deliverable, if you can talk about that, please?
Yes, absolutely. So, as already briefly touched upon, the key challenges to deployment of renewables at scale and pace are 1, receiving planning approval from local authorities, and 2, receiving grid connections from network operators. And related to this is the challenge of high level of constraints, meaning renewable generators having to dispatch down their generation due to insufficient network capacity to transport their output. So both planning permission and grid connections are scarce, and it can take several years to obtain them. So we're looking with the government currently into how this could impact reaching the 2030 target. And then in terms of design, a key design feature which is still being refined in this phase is the compensation for dispatch down due to constraints. So there are several reasons why a generator could be prevented to sell his output and be forced to dispatch down. And we have already concluded in the first phase that dispatch down should be compensated if the reason for the dispatch down are outside of the control of the developer, because that will be more efficient to compensate the developer or the generator than forcing them to price in this dispatch down into their bids, because typically it's quite likely that they will overestimate the extent of this dispatch down. But then how is the case with constraints? Developers may be able to manage constraints by locating in less congested areas of the grid. And that's why dispatch down due to constraints is currently not compensated in the RES scheme in the south. So the question of whether dispatch down due to constraints should be compensated is one of the key focus areas of our analysis in this next phase of the project.
From our experience, we have seen that in order to make sure that a subsidy scheme, or rather any policy instrument that will enable the development and production of renewable electricity, we need to have a robust and large enough grid. And in Ireland, what we've seen is that grid constraints have been developing in the last few years. Steph, I want to bring you in. What do you think about, like, if we compare let's say the I-SEM to other markets, how do they compare in terms of constraints on the grid?
Yeah, so the I-SEM in general has very high levels of dispatch down, a lot higher than what we see in some other countries. So historically, we've seen dispatch down levels exceed 15% within Northern Ireland, which is extremely high. And the main reason we see this is because we already have quite high renewable penetration within the island of Ireland. We have a lot of wind, but we have a really old grid, which has not seen a lot of development in the last years. So we don't have new cables coming online, particularly those large high voltage cables, which are going to be needed to transport renewables from a high resource area to a high demand area. We also see limitations within interconnection. So as I mentioned earlier, the I-SEM is made up of these two jurisdictions, and the only flows between the two are through the north-south tie line, which is half a gig in size. So it's very small and it becomes constrained and reaches maximum export very quickly. So what we've seen historically is Northern Ireland has actually been a very short market where we have not seen enough generation on the system. So we've had to lean on a lot of expensive thermal generation having to come online. But then as we start building more renewables, we're going to have issues of moving that renewable generation from that resource area to the demand area. So this is only going to make our grid constraints and our grid congestion worse as we go forward.
These very high-level constraints, I'm assuming that they can reduce a generator's revenues quite substantially, which is the case historically, and eliminate most of their profits. Michael, it seems like constraints must be very high up on the priority list of developers in the Northern Ireland market. Is that what you observe as well?
Yes, absolutely. So all developers we've been speaking to mention this as a key challenge for existing plans, but also a key issue which puts investment into new plans at risk. So many of these developers have already engaged with policymakers and legal institutions on this. And the Aurora advisory team will also conduct a multi-client study on the topic of grid constraint in the island of Ireland later this year. And many stakeholders have already expressed interest. So it's definitely a very high on the agenda of developers and generators in the island of Ireland.
I want to now shift gears and move towards the impact of this subsidy scheme on I-SEM. Steph, if I can bring you in. So what is the market sentiment around this new scheme? How do you think it will be received by market stakeholders?
I think this support scheme will be really high received. The renewable sector has been waiting on this for ages. The last time we've had a clear route to market through some government-backed scheme was the NERO, or the Northern Ireland ROC scheme, which closed to new entrants in 2017. So there's a desperate need from the market for a clear route to market for these projects. However, there's still some uncertainty around which projects will actually be ready to participate in this first auction. given the need for both planning permission and also a grid connection offer. And since these can often be delayed or appealed in any way, it'll be exciting to see who can actually get ready in time and who might need to wait for the second auction in 2027.
And Steph, given that this is a major policy intervention, a big new support scheme will surely impact the market. How do you see the scheme impacting I-SEM?
Yeah, absolutely. So this will have a huge impact. Let's start by talking about the kind of I-SEM's trajectory to net zero. So obviously this is going to help increase renewable penetration, but we've already mentioned it's going to be quite difficult to reach these targets because they are quite high and very ambitious, and we have a lot of issues surrounding planning, connections, and grid congestion. However, more renewable penetration is only going to help us reach net zero. So not only will this reduce the carbon intensity of the I-SEM by leaning on thermal generation less often, but this is also going to increase the level of independence on the system. So right now we are a net importer of electricity, and we've seen lately with all the issues we've seen across Europe that having energy independence and not relying on other countries for your own electricity supply is really important. So as we have more renewable penetration, we might need to import less or hopefully even become a net exporter of electricity, which only increases our security of supply. In combination with some of the really ambitious targets we see in the south as well, this is going to have knock-on impacts on the system composition, so capacity and generation as a whole, which, as I mentioned, is obviously going to squeeze out this thermal baseload generation. It's also going to have a huge impact on dispatch down. So as we see more renewables, we're going to have more instances of oversupply. SNSP is going to be met more often and be more limited. And we're also going to see more constraints. When we look at some of the other markets, so as we see the missing money problem for thermal assets get greater as we see increased renewable generation, means CCM prices or capacity market prices are only going to get larger and higher, and they're already at record highs, costing consumer a lot of money. As we see more renewable penetration, there's going to be a greater need for the procurement of inertia and also reserve services through DS3, which is the ancillary services within the I-SEM. And as I mentioned, as we have decreased imports, this is going to have a knock-on impact on some of the interconnected regions, particularly GB and France. So we are importing less often from them, which is going to reduce wholesale prices in low price periods across the continental Europe and interconnected countries. So there's some substantial changes happening across the sector as we start to decarbonize the system.
Right. So I think for our audiences, this is quite interesting, given that we have the subsidy schemes who are bringing in the lucrative renewables, and then we have new demand segments propping up from AI, from demand centers. And then we also have sector coupling, which is going to electrify the heat sector, the transport sector. So this means that more PPAs are going to prop up. So how does this impact the PPA market in the region, Steph?
Yeah, absolutely. So the PPA market within I-SEM is a really interesting one because we already have a lot of data centers. It's projected that by 2030, a third of the electricity demand within I-SEM will come from data centers because we have a pretty low tax environment. So it's kind of a hub for a lot of large data companies. So there's a huge demand for PPAs within the space. However, there's a pretty low supply for PPAs. We're not seeing a lot of renewables come through the planning process, so there's not a strong pipeline of projects there. So within the Republic of Ireland, what we've actually seen is the majority of projects opt for the subsidy scheme. So there's an extremely low supply, and it gives a lot of selling power to the developers when they try to negotiate PPAs. So what we've seen is some really high PPA prices come through the market. However, if you are eligible for RES, the power dynamic shifts. So then there's a lot of buying power from the off-taker in that circumstance. And this is what we see currently within Northern Ireland, where there is no other route to market. So there's a really wide range in the PPA prices, which we see within the I-SEM. So it will be interesting to see how the introduction of the support scheme in Northern Ireland moves that shift and starts giving developers more buying power or more selling power within the PPA market to negotiate higher terms.
Right. Michael, I want to move our audiences towards what comes next. So we have this high-level design, which needs to happen now. Steph has already mentioned some of the challenges arising from the systems perspective, but what are the key bottlenecks for the successful implementation of this scheme? As in, like, what are the roadblocks between where we stand today and reaching the 80% targets?
Yes, absolutely. So in phase 2 of this project, we're refining the scheme parameters based on further analysis of open questions. And we're also revising auction volumes and are determining a maximum strike price by in-depth analysis of the existing pipeline, as well as future renewable potential in Northern Ireland, given constraints from available land as well as from available grid connections. And as mentioned before, the main two roadblocks to more renewables are planning approval can cause significant delays. And then the second, grid reinforcement required to connect renewables can take several years to complete. So these are the key two roadblocks. And to expand on these issues in a bit more depth, for example, a key bottleneck in the planning system is that onshore wind farms must be located away from residential buildings by a distance of at least 10 times the rotor diameter. And modern turbines have rotor diameters of roughly 100 meters. So that means they must be over 1 kilometer away from any residential building. And our analysis has shown that this rules out already 92% of the land in Northern Ireland for development, because 92% of the land is within this sort of 1 kilometer distance from residential buildings. And so 92% of land is already unsuitable for development, just based on this requirement of distance requirement to residential buildings. And then overlaying other restrictions reduces the potential further, to the extent that any remaining land needs to be developed to meet the target. And the housing buffer is by far the greatest restriction, and it's likely that it needs to be reduced to give developers a better chance of finding a suitable site.
Michael, one would think that in the countryside, this distance to residential buildings would not be so restrictive, but it rules out the vast majority of the rural RAN, isn't it? So what are the key bottlenecks as far as grid reinforcement is concerned?
In terms of the grid reinforcement, there are some regulatory issues. First, so key issue is that the regulator tightly controls the amount of anticipatory investment in grid expansion and reinforcement, with most investment being reactive to new requests as opposed to proactively developing the network for the future. And furthermore, each grid expansion project must individually get funding approval, and this can take 6 to 12 months. Removing the need for this approval for each and every project could save up to a year of time for each of these reinforcement projects. So these are some regulatory issues. And there's a further issue: the grid connection and the planning approval, they can only happen in series and not in parallel. So in Northern Ireland, developers effectively need to have planning permission in order to apply for a grid connection. And this means that these two really time-intensive applications, which each on their own can take several years to complete, can currently not be run in parallel, but only in sequence, which increases the time needed to develop projects. And then finally, a final issue with grid connections is that batteries are snapping up a lot of the grid connections, of the new grid connections. And that's because they're quick to build and they don't need much land. So typically they can get planning permission relatively quickly. And Sony, the transmission system operator, has to be technology agnostic under its license. So it can't reserve any available connections to renewable generators. So more than 0.5 gigawatts of batteries in Northern Ireland have either applied for planning permission or already have received it. And those will rapidly occupy available grid connection points and compete with renewable generation for these connections.
Right. So before I let you both go, I want to wrap this conversation up by asking you to take off your Aurora hats for a moment and provide me with your opinion in terms of what you think if we'll make it to 80% by 2030 in the island of Ireland? Is that something that is realistic?
Honestly, I think this is going to be extremely difficult for the system operators to achieve.
Right. Michael, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Agreed that a lot needs to come together for this to work. The planning system needs reform. The network operators must make more connections available and expand the network. The regulator must clear large sums of anticipatory investment. But we have shown in our analysis that it's not impossible. But whether or not the scheme hits 80% in time in the end, I think it will increase renewable penetration and will help drive down prices and carbon emissions. And that's definitely a good thing.
I think it was quite an interesting, enlightening conversations, giving us an overview of not just I-SEM, but also the subsidy scheme in the region, subsidy schemes in the region, both the regions north and the south. So I would here thank both of you for your time and really appreciate your views on the subsidy scheme that we worked very hard to put together, and then of course the subsidy scheme and the comparison that we did with the RES, which is already embedded in let's say the south of the I-SEM. So Steph and Michael, thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks very much, Salman.
That was Salman Khan, principal in Aurora's advisory team covering Ireland and GB's electricity markets, with Michael Joos and Steph Unsworth, both senior associates. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow or subscribe to the podcast via whatever platform you use.